The carriage wheels stopped grinding against gravel, and Duke Alistair Whitmore stepped down before the iron gates of Ashworth Hall, with a folded warrant pressed inside his coat. 3 villagers had died of fever within a month of Lord Ashworth's death, and every whisper in the county pointed to the same name, Eleanor Ashworth, the widow who had inherited everything and grieved nothing. He had come to see her condemned. He had not expected the gates to already be broken, one hinge torn loose as though someone had forced their way out in a hurry, not in. A steward met him at the entrance, a thin man named Godfrey whose hands trembled as he bowed. Behind him, the hall stood dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon light, as if the house itself wished to hide. "Her ladyship is not receiving visitors," Godfrey said, though his eyes darted toward the staircase as he spoke, betraying a fear that had nothing to do with etiquette. "I am not a visitor," Alistair said. "I carry the magistrate's warrant. Take me to her." Godfrey did not move immediately. For a moment, something crossed his face that looked less like defiance and more like dread, as though the greater danger lay not in refusing a duke, but in what waited upstairs. Alistair climbed the staircase himself, boots echoing against stone that had clearly once been polished and was now dulled with neglect. He passed portraits with their frames askew, as if someone had recently searched behind them. At the end of the corridor, a door stood ajar, and through the gap, he saw her. Eleanor Ashworth sat by a cold hearth, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the mild weather. Her dark hair was pulled back without ornament, and her face, though pale, held a sharpness in the eyes that surprised him. He had expected guilt. He had expected the practiced sorrow of a woman playing a part. Instead, he found exhaustion so deep, it seemed carved into her bones. "You must be the Duke they sent," she said without turning. Her voice was steady, but her hands, folded in her lap, were not. "Come to see the murderess for yourself." "I have come to investigate the deaths of 3 men in this parish," Alistair said. "Whether you are guilty remains to be seen." "How generous," she said, and there was no warmth in it. "Most men have already decided." He studied her more closely then, and it was in that moment he saw it. The sleeve of her gown had slipped slightly as she reached for the poker to stir the dead ashes, revealing a mark on her wrist, dark and fresh, shaped unmistakably like fingers that had gripped too hard. She noticed him looking, and pulled the fabric down quickly, but not quickly enough. "An accident," she said, before he could ask. "I did not ask. You were about to." He said nothing, but the image stayed with him as he excused himself and began his walk through the house, ostensibly to inspect the grounds where the poisoned well was said to be. Along the way he passed a nursery door, locked from the outside with a heavy iron bolt, unusual for a room meant to hold nothing more dangerous than a child's toys. He paused before it, listening. He heard nothing, but the hallway around it felt colder than the rest of the house. Further on, near the stables, he came upon a boy no older than 14, sitting on an overturned bucket while a young woman knelt before him, pressing a damp cloth to his back beneath a torn shirt. The boy flinched at her touch, and she murmured something too soft for Alistair to hear, something meant only for the boy's ears, meant to steady him. It was Eleanor. She had changed her shawl for a plain apron and moved with a competence that spoke of long practice, not the delicate hands of a lady unfamiliar with wounds. When she noticed Alistair watching from the stable door, she did not flinch or apologize. She simply finished her work, tied the bandage with practiced fingers, and sent the boy off with a coin and a quiet word of thanks for his patience. "You did not strike me as the sort of woman to tend to servants herself," Alistair said. "You did not strike me as the sort of man to wander stables uninvited," Eleanor replied, rising and wiping her hands on her apron. "Yet here we both are, doing things people would not expect. What happened to him?" "Ask your questions about the well," she said. "Ask about poison and fever and whatever tale brought you through my gates. But do not ask me about my household. That is not why you came. Perhaps it should be part of why I stay." Something flickered across her face then, surprise perhaps, or suspicion that he was toying with her. She turned and walked back toward the house without another word, and Alistair remained by the stable a moment longer, turning over what he had seen. A locked nursery, a boy with wounds hidden beneath his shirt. A widow accused of poison who spent her afternoons binding injuries with the calm of someone who had done it many times before. He had arrived expecting a simple case, a woman driven by greed, perhaps madness, who had removed her husband and anyone who threatened to expose her. Instead, every detail he uncovered pointed somewhere else entirely, toward a fear that lived inside these walls long before he ever arrived, and toward a woman who seemed less like a predator and more like someone who had survived one. That evening, as the last light faded from the windows, Alistair found Godfrey alone in the study, sorting through ledgers with an urgency that suggested he did not want to be discovered doing so. "Tell me about the nursery," Alistair said, and watched the old steward's hands still completely. "There is nothing to tell, Your Grace." "Then why is it locked from the outside?" Godfrey did not answer. He closed the ledger before him, and in the candlelight, Alistair caught sight of a name written across its spine in faded ink. Not Eleanor's name, not even Lord Ashworth's. A different name entirely, one that meant nothing to him yet, but one he suspected would come to mean everything before this was finished. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and somewhere deep in the house, a door creaked open and shut again, though no one had been near it. Alistair felt, for the first time since arriving, that the danger in this house was not something he had brought with him. It had been waiting long before he came. The next morning, Alistair requested access to the household records, expecting Eleanor to refuse him outright. Instead, she led him to the study herself, pulling out ledgers and letters with a briskness that suggested she had nothing left to hide, or had decided hiding was no longer worth the effort. "You will find what you find," she said, setting the papers before him. "I will not stop you." He spent the morning poring over accounts, tracking payments to physicians, to the parish, to tradesmen who supplied the household. Nothing seemed unusual at first glance, but as he cross-referenced dates, a pattern emerged that unsettled him more than any single discovery could have. Payments to a physician in the neighboring village, made not after Lord Ashworth's death, but for months before it, always following visits that coincided with Eleanor's absences from public gatherings, absences the local gossip had attributed to illness or temperament. He found a second pattern too, buried deeper. Small sums paid quietly to servants who had left the household abruptly, always with generous severance, always without explanation recorded in the ledger beyond a single word written beside each name. Gone. When he brought this to Eleanor that afternoon, she did not deny it, but neither did she explain. She simply looked at him with an expression that dared him to ask the question directly, to say aloud what he was beginning to suspect. "You are not investigating a poisoning," she said quietly. "Not really. You are investigating a marriage. Were the two so different?" She did not answer that. She only turned toward the window, where the ground stretched toward the edge of the woods, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Alistair realized, watching her, that whatever he had come here to find, he was no longer certain it was the truth she had been accused of hiding. It was something else, something the entire household seemed to be protecting her from having to say aloud. And somewhere in that silence, he understood that his investigation had only just begun, and that the real danger at Ashworth Hall had not yet shown itself at all. That night, unable to sleep, Alistair walked the upper corridor again, past the locked nursery, past the portraits with their frames disturbed. He noticed, this time, a thin line of light beneath the nursery door, flickering as though a candle burned inside a room no one was meant to enter. He raised his hand to knock, then stopped himself, remembering Godfrey's face when the room had been mentioned, remembering the fear that lived in every corner of this house. He returned to his chamber, but sleep did not come easily. Somewhere below him, he heard footsteps crossing the hall, soft and deliberate, and then the quiet click of a door closing. He told himself it was only a servant attending to some late chore, but some instinct, sharpened by years spent reading men and their lies, told him otherwise. Ashworth Hall was not simply a house in mourning. It was a house holding its breath, waiting to see whether the truth would survive the arrival of a stranger who had come to judge it. A scream tore through the house before dawn, sharp and short, cut off as quickly as it began. Alistair was on his feet before he had fully woken, pulling on his coat as he moved into the corridor, where he found Godfrey already at the top of the stairs, candle shaking in his hand. "It came from the west wing," Godfrey said, though his voice suggested he already knew more than he wished to say. They found Eleanor standing outside the locked nursery, the iron bolt thrown back, the door wide open, and her face white as the nightgown she wore. Inside the room, a single candle burned on a small table beside an empty bed, its blankets pulled back as though someone had left in a hurry, or been taken from it. "He is gone," Eleanor said, and for the first time since Alistair had arrived, her composure shattered completely. "He was here. I checked before I went to sleep, and he was here." "Who?" Alistair asked, though even as he spoke, understanding began to settle over him, cold and unwelcome. "My son," Eleanor said. "Lord Ashworth's son. He is 7 years old, and someone has taken him from this house." The revelation struck Alistair harder than he expected. No one in the village had spoken of a child. No rumor, no gossip, not even the whispered accusations against Eleanor had mentioned a son. It was as though the boy had been erased from every conversation that took place beyond these walls, kept hidden not by chance but by design. Why was he locked away? Alistair demanded. Why has no one spoken his name since I arrived? Eleanor turned to him, her eyes bright with something between grief and fury. Because the moment anyone learns he exists, he becomes a target. He is the heir to everything my husband owned, and there are those who would see him gone, so the inheritance passes elsewhere. I locked that door to keep him safe, not to hide a crime. Do you understand the difference, Your Grace, or has your warrant blinded you to it? Alistair did not answer immediately. He moved past her into the room, examining the window, which stood open despite the night's chill, the latch broken from the outside. Whoever had taken the boy had come prepared, moving with the confidence of someone familiar with the house, someone who knew exactly which room to find and how to reach it without waking the rest of the household. Who else knew this room existed? Alistair asked. The staff, my husband's brother. Anyone who visited before his death. Eleanor's voice caught on the word brother, and Alistair filed the reaction away, unwilling yet to press further while the boy remained missing. They searched the grounds through the remaining hours of darkness, torches casting long shadows across the gardens and toward the tree line beyond. Eleanor moved through the search with a determination that left no room for the polite restraint expected of a lady of her station, climbing over fences, calling her son's name into the woods with a voice that cracked more with each unanswered call. It was Alistair who found the first sign, a scrap of fabric caught on a low branch near the edge of the property, matching the description of the boy's nightclothes. Beyond it, wheel tracks pressed into the soft earth of the road, leading away from the estate toward the village and beyond. Someone had a carriage waiting, Alistair said, kneeling to examine the tracks more closely. This was planned. Eleanor knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched the fabric. If anything happens to him, we will find him, Alistair said, and surprised himself with the certainty in his own voice. He had arrived at Ashworth Hall to investigate a widow accused of murder. He had not expected to find himself standing in the dark beside her, bound by a shared purpose neither of them had chosen. They returned to the house as the sky began to lighten, and Alistair called for his own men, stationed at the village inn, to begin a search along every road leading from the estate. Eleanor, meanwhile, retreated to the study, pulling out correspondence and estate documents with shaking hands, searching for anything that might explain who among her acquaintances would want her son gone. "Tell me about your husband's brother," Alistair said, joining her at the desk. Eleanor's hands stilled over the papers. "Edmund. He has always resented that the estate passed to my husband and not to him, though he is the elder by only a few years. When my husband died, and there were whispers that I might be blamed for it, Edmund did nothing to discourage them. If anything, he seemed to welcome the rumors. Because if you are convicted, the estate would pass to the next male heir. To my son, formally, but a boy of 7 cannot manage an estate. Edmund would be named guardian, and control would fall to him regardless of whose name sits on the deed." Eleanor looked up at him, and for the first time, something like hope flickered across her exhausted face. "If Edmund has taken my son, it is because he believes the boy is now the only obstacle standing between him and everything he has wanted for years." Alistair felt the pieces beginning to align into a shape far different from the one he had arrived expecting. He had come to investigate a widow's guilt. Instead, he was beginning to see the outline of a much older scheme, one that predated his arrival by years, and one that had used the rumors surrounding Eleanor as cover for something far more calculated. "I need to see every letter Edmund has sent this household in the past year," Alistair said. "And I need to know where he has been staying since your husband's death." Eleanor did not hesitate. She rose and led him to a locked cabinet in the corner of the study, retrieving a small brass key from a chain hidden beneath her collar. Inside, bundles of correspondence sat tied with ribbon, each one addressed in a hand Alistair did not yet recognize but suspected he soon would. As she handed him the first bundle, her fingers brushed his, and for a moment, neither of them moved to pull away. It was a small thing, barely noticeable amid the fear and urgency consuming the house, but Alistair felt it settle into him nonetheless, a quiet reminder that whatever else this investigation uncovered, it had already changed the terms on which he had arrived. "Find him," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes steady on his. "Find my son, and I will give you every truth this house has ever hidden." "I intend to find both," Alistair said, "the boy and the truth. I do not believe they are separate matters any longer." Outside, the search parties fanned out along the roads leading from Ashworth Hall, and somewhere beyond the tree line, a carriage carrying a frightened 7-year-old boy moved steadily away from the only home he had ever known, driven by a man who had waited years for an opportunity exactly like this one. The morning light broke fully over the estate, but inside the house, the darkness that had settled the night before showed no sign of lifting. If anything, it had only deepened, drawing Alistair and Eleanor together in a shared purpose neither of them could yet name, but both of them understood would not release its grip until the truth, however dangerous, had been dragged fully into the light. The letters told a story that took Alistair most of the morning to fully piece together. Edmund's handwriting grew bolder and more demanding with each passing month after his brother's death, his early condolences giving way to thinly veiled threats disguised as concern for the family's reputation. In one letter, dated only weeks after the funeral, Edmund suggested that Eleanor consider sending the boy away to be raised by relatives, citing the dangers of raising a young heir alone. In another, he warned that continued rumors about her involvement in her husband's death could only be silenced if she agreed to certain arrangements regarding the estate's management, arrangements that would place him firmly in control. Eleanor had refused every proposal, and with each refusal, Edmund's letters grew colder, more clipped, until they stopped altogether 3 months before Alistair's arrival. The silence, Alistair now understood, had not meant Edmund abandoned his ambitions. It had meant he changed his approach from persuasion to something far more dangerous. He stopped writing because he no longer needed to ask, Alistair said, laying the final letter on the desk. He had already decided what he intended to do. Eleanor sat across from him, her face drawn with exhaustion but her eyes sharp with a determination that had not existed when Alistair first arrived. I should have seen it sooner. I told myself he was simply grieving in his own bitter way. You were protecting your son the only way you knew how, by locking him away from a world that had already decided who deserved blame for his father's death. Alistair paused, choosing his next words carefully. Eleanor, I must ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Did your husband die of poison? She did not look away. My husband died of a growth in his stomach that had been slowly killing him for over a year. The physician who attended him can confirm this, though he has since left the county and stopped answering correspondence. I believe Edmund found it, paid him to disappear. Why would anyone believe otherwise? Because 3 villagers who worked closely with our household died of fever within weeks of my husband's passing, and it was easier for people to believe a widow had poisoned her way to freedom than to accept a coincidence. Edmund made certain that belief took root. He spoke to the right people, planted the right doubts, and stood back to watch the rumors grow on their own. Eleanor's hands tightened into fists on the desk. He built a case against me without ever having to lift a hand himself. And now, with my son taken, I fear he intends to finish what the rumors could not. Alistair rose from his chair, pacing the length of the study as he considered the shape of what they now faced. If Edmund had orchestrated Eleanor's downfall through whispers and suspicion alone, taking the boy represented an escalation, a sign that patience had run out, and desperation had taken its place. We need to know where he has been staying, Alistair said. The letters mention no address. He kept a hunting lodge on the northern edge of the estate, inherited through our mother's side of the family before she passed. He rarely used it, claiming the isolation suited his temperament when he wished to avoid society. I have not been there in years, but it would explain how he managed to move about the county without drawing attention. Then that is where we begin. Before they could act on the information, Godfrey appeared at the study door, his face pale and his breathing uneven from having climbed the stairs too quickly. Your Grace, my lady, one of the search parties has returned. They found the carriage abandoned along the northern road, not far from the old mill. Alistair exchanged a glance with Eleanor before following Godfrey down to the courtyard, where a young man from the village stood beside a tired horse, recounting what his group had discovered. The carriage had been left overturned in a ditch, one wheel broken, but there was no sign of the driver or the boy. A trail of small footprints led away from the wreck toward the woods, alongside larger prints that suggested someone had followed close behind, likely forcing the boy to move rather than allowing him to run freely. He is alive, Eleanor said, gripping the edge of the courtyard wall. He must be alive if there are footprints leading away. We will follow them, Alistair said, already calling for his own horse to be saddled. Godfrey, gather every able man from the estate. Eleanor, I need you to remain here in case Edmund attempts to contact the household with demands. I will not simply wait while my son is out there, Eleanor said, and the fierceness in her voice left no room for argument. I have waited long enough for other people to decide my fate and his. I am coming with you. Alistair considered refusing her, weighing the danger against her insistence, but something in her expression told him that no argument would sway her, and that time spent arguing was time better spent moving. Then stay close, and do exactly as I instruct when the moment calls for it. They rode out within the hour, following the trail of footprints as it wound deeper into the woods bordering the northern edge of the estate. The terrain grew rougher as they advanced, thick underbrush giving way to rocky outcroppings that made the horses' footing uncertain. Alistair dismounted at several points to examine broken branches and disturbed earth, piecing together a path that seemed to lead with increasing directness toward higher ground. The lodge sits atop that ridge, Eleanor said, pointing toward a distant rise where a thin line of smoke curled into the afternoon sky. Someone has lit a fire there. They approached with caution, leaving the horses tethered a distance from the lodge to avoid alerting anyone inside to their presence. Alistair moved ahead, motioning for Eleanor to remain low behind a cluster of boulders while he circled toward the rear of the building, searching for a way to see inside without revealing himself. Through a narrow window he caught sight of the boy, seated on a wooden chair near the fire, his hands bound loosely at the wrists, his face streaked with dirt but otherwise unharmed. A man Alistair did not recognize stood near the door, armed and watchful, clearly stationed there to prevent any attempt at escape. There was no sign of Edmund himself, though Alistair suspected he would not be far, unwilling to risk being seen carrying out the scheme with his own hands. He returned to where Eleanor waited, relaying what he had seen. Her relief at learning her son remained unharmed was immediate and overwhelming, tears slipping free before she could stop them. But it gave way quickly to a hardened resolve as she considered how best to proceed. There is only one guard visible, Alistair said. If Edmund is not present, this may be our best opportunity to retrieve your son before matters grow more complicated. And if Edmund arrives while we attempt it, then we adjust our approach. But we cannot wait for a safer moment that may never come. They devised a plan quickly, drawing on the terrain around the lodge to their advantage. Eleanor would circle toward the front, drawing the guard's attention with a distraction, while Alistair approached from the rear, using the same window he had used to observe the room to gain entry, without alerting anyone inside. The plan unfolded with more tension than either of them anticipated. Eleanor's approach toward the front of the lodge, feigning a lost traveler seeking directions, drew the guard outside just long enough for Alistair to force the rear window open and slip inside. The boy's eyes went wide at the sight of him, but Alistair pressed a finger to his lips, working quickly to loosen the ropes binding his wrists. "Your mother is here," Alistair whispered. "We are going to leave quietly, and you must trust me completely until we are away from this place." The boy nodded, understanding in his young eyes despite the fear still evident on his face. Alistair guided him toward the window, lifting him through it just as raised voices erupted from the front of the lodge, the guard's suspicion apparently overriding his patience for Eleanor's fabricated story. They moved quickly through the trees, Alistair carrying the boy while Eleanor followed close behind, the sound of pursuit growing louder as the guard realized what had happened and called out an alarm. Shouts echoed through the woods, and somewhere behind them, Alistair heard the unmistakable sound of a second voice joining the first, deeper and more commanding, a voice that made Eleanor's steps falter for just a moment before she pushed herself to move faster. "That is him," she said breathlessly. "That is Edmund." They reached the horses just as their pursuers broke through the tree line behind them, and Alistair lifted the boy onto his own mount before helping Eleanor up behind him, urging the horses into a full gallop back toward the estate. Behind them, Edmund's voice carried across the woods, not shouting orders to give chase, but calling out something else entirely, a warning that struck Alistair as strange, even amid the chaos of their escape. "This is not finished," Edmund called, his voice carrying clearly through the trees. "You have only delayed the inevitable, Eleanor. The truth will still find you, no matter how many dukes you hide behind." The words lingered in Alistair's mind long after they had left the woods behind, a promise rather than a threat, born of frustration. Edmund had not sounded like a man who had simply lost a hostage. He had sounded like a man who still believed he held the upper hand, who possessed some remaining piece of leverage that neither Alistair nor Eleanor yet understood. They returned to Ashworth Hall as the sun began to set, the boy safely delivered into the arms of servants who wept openly at his return. Eleanor held her son for a long moment before allowing him to be led away for food and rest, her hands still trembling from the events of the day. "We saved him," she said quietly, almost as though she needed to hear the words aloud to believe them. For now, Alistair agreed. "But Edmund's words concern me. He spoke as though he still holds something over you, something beyond the boy." Eleanor's expression grew distant, troubled by a memory she had not yet shared. "There is a document," she said slowly. "One my husband signed before his death, during the worst of his illness, when his mind was not entirely his own. Edmund helped draft it, claiming it was simply an update to the household accounts. I never saw its full contents. If Edmund possesses a version of my husband's will that names him guardian regardless of the boy's safety, today's rescue may mean little in the eyes of the law." Alistair felt the weight of her words settle over him, understanding now that today's victory, however necessary, had not ended the threat facing Eleanor and her son. It had only delayed a confrontation that would eventually have to be settled not in the woods, but in the eyes of the law itself, where documents and signatures carried more weight than truth alone. "Then we find that document," Alistair said, "before Edmund has the chance to use it." Night fell fully over Ashworth Hall, and though the boy slept safely in his own bed for the first time in what felt like far too long, neither Alistair nor Eleanor found rest easily, both aware that the danger surrounding them had not ended with the rescue, but had merely revealed itself to be far larger and more deeply rooted than either of them had first believed. Word arrived at first light that Edmund had ridden into the village overnight, presenting himself at the magistrate's office with a document he claimed proved his rightful authority over the Ashworth estate and its heir. Alistair received the news from one of his own men, sent ahead to keep watch on the village square, and felt a cold certainty settle over him that the confrontation Eleanor had feared was no longer a distant possibility, but a matter already unfolding without them. "He moves quickly," Alistair said, folding the message and setting it aside. "He must have anticipated we would attempt to expose him and decided to act before we could gather enough evidence to counter his claim." Eleanor stood at the window of the study, watching the road that led toward the village with an expression that mixed fear and defiance in equal measure. "The magistrate has always been sympathetic to Edmund. They hunt together, dine together. If Edmund presents a document bearing my husband's signature, the magistrate will see little reason to question it, especially with rumors of poison still clinging to my name." "Then we present a stronger case," Alistair said. "We have Edmund's letters showing a clear pattern of intent. We have the testimony of villagers who witnessed the abduction, and we have the boy himself, who can describe exactly how he came to be taken from this house. A child's testimony against a grown man's signed document. I fear the magistrate will not weigh them equally." Alistair understood the truth in her words, but he refused to accept that the scales of justice in this county had tipped so completely toward corruption that truth itself no longer mattered. He spent the remainder of the morning drafting a formal account of the previous day's events, gathering statements from the villagers who had assisted in the search, and preparing Godfrey to testify regarding the ledger entries he had uncovered in the household accounts, entries that showed payments made to servants who had mysteriously left the household after witnessing incidents they were clearly meant to forget. By midday, word came that the magistrate had scheduled a formal hearing for the following morning to determine the rightful guardianship of Eleanor's son and, by extension, the future control of the Ashworth estate. Edmund had requested the hearing be held publicly, a decision that struck Alistair as strange until Eleanor explained its likely purpose. "He wants an audience," she said. "He wants the village to witness my humiliation, to see the widow they already suspect of murder lose her son in full view of everyone who has whispered against her. It will cement whatever doubts remain and ensure no one questions his authority afterward." "Then we give him an audience," Alistair said, "but not the one he expects." That afternoon, Alistair rode into the village himself, seeking out the physician who had originally attended Lord Ashworth during his final illness, the same man Eleanor believed Edmund had paid to disappear. He found the man's former lodgings abandoned, the landlord confirming that the physician had left suddenly several months earlier, offering no explanation beyond a hurried apology and enough coin to cover any inconvenience his departure might cause. Frustrated but not defeated, Alistair sought out the parish records instead, hoping to find some official documentation of Lord Ashworth's illness that might corroborate Eleanor's account independent of the physician's testimony. The parish clerk, an elderly man with a meticulous memory, recalled the late lord's declining health clearly, describing symptoms consistent with a long illness rather than sudden poisoning, and agreed to provide a written statement to that effect for the hearing. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one, chipping away at the foundation of rumor that had painted Eleanor as a murderess long before any formal accusation had been raised against her. Alistair returned to Ashworth Hall as evening fell, finding Eleanor in the nursery, seated beside her son's bed as the boy slept, his small hand still curled around hers even in rest. "He asked me today if the man from the woods would come back," Eleanor said quietly, not looking up as Alistair entered. "I did not know how to answer him honestly. Tomorrow, we ensure he never has cause to fear that man again." Eleanor finally looked up at him, And in the dim candlelight, Alistair saw something in her expression that had not been there when he first arrived at Ashworth Hall. A fragile but growing trust that had survived accusation, danger, and fear in equal measure. "You did not have to involve yourself this deeply," she said. "You came here to investigate a crime, not to risk your own standing defending a widow the whole county already condemns." "I came to find the truth," Alistair said. "I did not expect the truth to matter to me as much as it has come to." "But it does, Eleanor. You do." The words hung between them, quiet but unmistakable. And for a moment, the weight of everything else pressing against them, the hearing, Edmund's scheme, the danger still circling the estate, seemed to fade into something more distant. Eleanor did not look away, and neither did he, until the boy stirred slightly in his sleep, breaking the moment as gently as it had formed. "We should rest," Eleanor said softly. "Tomorrow will demand everything we have." Alistair nodded, though sleep proved as elusive that night as it had the evening before. He spent the hours reviewing every document, every statement, every piece of evidence they had gathered, searching for any gap Edmund might exploit before the magistrate. He found himself, more than once, thinking not only of the case before them, but of Eleanor herself, of the resilience she had shown throughout an ordeal that would have broken lesser people, and of the quiet moment they had shared beside her son's bed. By the time dawn broke, Alistair had assembled a case he believed capable of withstanding Edmund's forged authority, but a lingering unease remained. Edmund had moved too confidently, too quickly, for a man relying solely on a single document to secure his claim. Alistair suspected there was more to his plan than had yet revealed itself, some final maneuver being held in reserve for the hearing itself. He was not wrong to suspect it. As the household prepared to depart for the village that morning, a messenger arrived bearing a second piece of news, one that changed the shape of the coming confrontation entirely. The physician who had vanished months earlier had been found, not by Alistair's men, but by Edmund's, and according to the messenger, the physician had agreed to testify at the hearing on Edmund's behalf, prepared to claim that Lord Ashworth's death had indeed been unnatural, and that Eleanor herself had requested his silence in exchange for a substantial payment. "It is a lie," Eleanor said, her voice tight with barely restrained fury as she absorbed the news. "I never spoke to that man beyond arranging his visits to attend my husband. Edmund has bought his testimony, just as he bought his silence before." "Then we must prove it," Alistair said, though even as he spoke the words he recognized the difficulty of the task before them. A paid witness, prepared with a rehearsed account, would be difficult to unravel in the limited time remaining before the hearing began. "We need something Edmund has not anticipated, some piece of evidence he believes remains safely hidden." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her mind clearly working through possibilities. Then her expression shifted, a spark of realization breaking through her exhaustion. "The lodge," she said. "When we rescued my son, we left before searching the building itself. If Edmund kept the forged will there, along with correspondence relating to the physician's payment, evidence may still remain, if he has not yet returned to remove it. It is a risk," Alistair said. "If we are discovered searching his property without cause, it could be used against us at the hearing itself." "It is a risk we must take," Eleanor said, "because if we walk into that hearing with nothing but our word against his paid witness and his stolen document, we will lose everything, regardless of what is true." Alistair studied her for a moment, recognizing in her determination the same resolve that had carried her through years of quiet suffering at her husband's hands, through the loss of her husband himself, through the abduction of her son, and now through a final battle for everything she still held dear. He made his decision quickly, calling for 2 of his most trusted men to accompany them on a final journey to the lodge before the hearing began, leaving them only a narrow window of time to search the building and return before their absence would be noticed. They rode out beneath a sky still gray with early morning light, the estate falling away behind them as they retraced the path toward the northern ridge, uncertain what they would find, but certain that whatever awaited them at the lodge would determine far more than the outcome of a single hearing. It would determine whether truth, however carefully buried, still had the power to outweigh a lie dressed in the authority of signed paper and rehearsed testimony. The lodge appeared quiet as they approached, no smoke rising from its chimney, no sign of the guard who had watched over Eleanor's son 2 days earlier. Alistair signaled for his men to circle the building while he and Eleanor approached the front entrance, finding the door unlocked, as though whoever had last left it had not expected anyone to return so soon. Inside, the lodge showed signs of hasty departure. A chair lay overturned near the fireplace, and papers had been scattered across a small writing desk in the corner, some torn, others simply abandoned mid-organization, Eleanor moved quickly to the desk, sorting through the remaining documents with an urgency that betrayed how little time she believed they had. "Here," she said, pulling a folded paper from beneath a stack of unrelated correspondence. "This is my husband's signature, but look at the wording. It grants guardianship to Edmund, regardless of my son's well-being, regardless of any future circumstances. My husband would never have written such terms. He loved our son too deeply to leave him so completely at another man's mercy." Alistair took the document, examining the signature closely. Something about the ink's consistency struck him as inconsistent with the rest of the page, as though it had been added separately from the body of the text. This may have been forged after the fact, the true will altered or replaced entirely. If we can find the original, or proof of when this signature was actually added, it would unravel Edmund's entire claim. They continued searching, uncovering a second set of documents that confirmed their worst suspicions. Letters between Edmund and the physician detailed a clear arrangement. Payment offered in exchange for testimony claiming Lord Ashworth's death had come from poison rather than illness, with specific instructions on what the physician should say if questioned by any investigating authority. The letters were damning, written in Edmund's own hand, with dates that aligned precisely with the physician's sudden disappearance months earlier. "This is enough," Alistair said, gathering the letters carefully. "This alone should be sufficient to discredit any testimony he brings before the magistrate." A sound from outside interrupted them before Eleanor could respond, hurried footsteps approaching the lodge, and Alistair's men calling out a warning that someone was returning. He had only moments to decide how to proceed, weighing the value of the evidence they had found against the danger of being discovered with it in hand. "We leave now," he said, folding the documents securely into his coat. "We have what we need." They exited through the rear of the lodge just as voices reached the front entrance, Edmund's unmistakable among them, sharp with anger as he discovered the disturbed papers on his desk. Alistair and Eleanor moved quickly toward the tree line where their horses waited, but their retreat had not gone entirely unnoticed. A shout rose behind them, and moments later, the sound of pursuit crashed through the underbrush. "Ride," Alistair said, boosting Eleanor onto her horse before mounting his own. They broke into a full gallop, weaving through the trees with a speed born of necessity rather than caution, branches tearing at their clothing as they pushed toward the safety of open ground. Behind them, Edmund's voice carried through the woods, no longer controlled, no longer calculating, but raw with the fury of a man watching years of careful planning collapse in the span of a single morning. "You will not use lies against me in that hearing," he shouted. "Whatever you believe you have found changes nothing. My claim stands regardless." They did not slow to answer him, pressing their horses harder until the sounds of pursuit finally faded behind them, swallowed by distance and the thickening trees. When they finally emerged onto the open road leading back toward the village, both were breathing hard, hearts pounding not only from the physical exertion of the ride, but from the narrow margin by which they had escaped discovery. "We have little time before the hearing begins," Eleanor said, glancing at the sky, where the sun had climbed higher than either of them had anticipated during their search. "If we do not arrive with this evidence in hand, none of it will matter." They rode directly to the village, arriving at the magistrate's hall just as the proceedings were set to begin. A crowd had gathered outside, drawn by curiosity and the promise of witnessing the widow's public reckoning, whispers rippling through the assembled villagers as Eleanor and Alistair dismounted and made their way toward the entrance. Inside, the hall had been arranged with the magistrate seated at the front, Edmund already present near the front rows, his composure restored despite the chase through the woods only an hour earlier. Beside him sat a thin, nervous man Alistair recognized immediately as the physician, dressed in unfamiliar finery that suggested Edmund's payment had been generous indeed. The magistrate called the hearing to order, and Edmund rose first, presenting his forged document with a confidence that filled the hall, describing in careful detail his brother's supposed wishes regarding the estate's future should any doubt arise concerning Eleanor's fitness to raise their son. He called upon the physician next, who delivered his rehearsed testimony with only the faintest tremor betraying the falsehood beneath his words, claiming Lord Ashworth had shown clear signs of poisoning in his final days, signs he had been persuaded to keep silent about until now. Murmurs spread through the crowd as the physician spoke, old suspicions hardening once again into something resembling certainty. Eleanor sat rigid beside Alistair, her hands clenched in her lap, but her expression remained composed, refusing to give the assembled crowd the satisfaction of watching her break beneath the weight of accusations she knew to be false. When the magistrate finally turned to Alistair and Eleanor, inviting their response, Alistair rose slowly, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to command the room's full attention before he began. "I have spent the past several days investigating the claims brought before this hearing," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "And I have found not evidence of a widow's guilt, but evidence of a calculated scheme, designed to strip a mother of her son, and an estate of its rightful heir." He presented the letters recovered from the lodge, reading passages aloud that detailed Edmund's arrangement with the physician, the specific payment offered, the precise testimony requested in exchange. The hall fell silent as the words settled over the crowd, the physician's face draining of color as his own correspondence was read back to him in a room full of witnesses. "This is fabrication," Edmund said, rising sharply from his seat. "You cannot simply present letters and claim them genuine without proper verification. The handwriting matches your own correspondence with this household over the past year, samples of which I also possess," Alistair replied evenly. "I invite the magistrate to compare them directly, alongside the will you presented, which I believe upon closer examination will show a signature, added separately from the body of the document, in ink that does not match the remainder of the page." The magistrate, visibly unsettled by the mounting evidence, called for both documents to be examined more closely, and as the comparison unfolded before the assembled crowd, the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Edmund's composure finally cracked, his earlier confidence giving way to visible desperation as he realized the careful scheme he had constructed was unraveling in full view of everyone he had hoped to convince. "Ask him," Alistair said, turning to address the physician directly, whether the payment he received came before or after he agreed to leave the county so quickly following Lord Ashworth's death. Ask him why a man with no prior history of sudden relocation abandoned his practice within days of a nobleman's passing, only to resurface now, dressed in clothing far finer than any physician's modest income could provide. The physician's nerve broke completely under the weight of the room's collective attention, his rehearsed testimony crumbling into a stammering admission that Edmund had indeed paid him to leave and to return only when summoned, with specific instructions on what to say should he ever be called to testify. The crowd's murmurs shifted from suspicion of Eleanor to open condemnation of Edmund, whispers turning quickly to accusation as the truth settled over the hall. Edmund, seeing his scheme collapse entirely, made one final attempt to salvage his position, turning to the crowd with a desperate plea that painted himself as a man merely protecting his family's interests, misguided perhaps, but not malicious. The magistrate, however, had heard enough, calling for order and announcing that the matter would require further formal investigation, with Edmund himself now facing scrutiny for his role in fabricating evidence and orchestrating the abduction of a child. As guards moved to detain Edmund pending further inquiry, he turned one final time toward Eleanor, his expression twisted with a bitterness that had clearly festered for years beyond what any single scheme could explain. "You were never meant to have any of this," he said, his voice low but carrying through the suddenly quiet hall. "Not the estate, not my brother's love, not the son who should have been raised by someone capable of protecting what our family built. I only sought to correct what should never have belonged to you in the first place." "It was never yours to take," Eleanor said, rising to meet his gaze without flinching. "And it never will be." The guards led Edmund from the hall, his protests fading as he was escorted away, and the crowd that had gathered to witness Eleanor's condemnation slowly began to disperse, many offering quiet apologies for rumors they now recognized as unfounded, others simply departing in silence, unwilling to acknowledge how easily they had been swayed by whispers and suspicion rather than truth. Eleanor remained standing at the center of the hall long after the crowd had thinned, the weight of everything she had endured finally beginning to settle over her now that the immediate danger had passed. Alistair moved to stand beside her, and for a long moment, neither spoke, the silence between them carrying more meaning than words could easily capture. "It is over," she said finally, though her voice carried more disbelief than relief. "Not entirely," Alistair said. "There remains the matter of formally clearing your name before the full county, and ensuring your son's inheritance is protected beyond any doubt. But the worst of it, I believe, has passed." Eleanor turned to face him fully then, and in her eyes, Alistair saw not only the exhaustion of a woman who had fought for years to protect everything she loved, but something else as well, a fragile hope that had not existed when he first arrived at her gates prepared to condemn her. "You could have simply confirmed the rumors and returned to your own life," she said. "Instead, you stayed. You fought beside me when you had no obligation to do so." "I stayed because the truth demanded it," Alistair said quietly, "and because somewhere along the way, you came to matter to me, far beyond the boundaries of any investigation." The words settled between them, honest and unguarded in a way neither had allowed themselves to be since his arrival, and outside the hall, the village continued its quiet business, unaware that within those walls, an ending had just begun to take shape, one neither of them had anticipated when this ordeal first began. News of Edmund's arrest spread through the county faster than any rumor that had come before it, and within days, the story of the widow falsely accused reached every household from the village square to the farthest estates. Where whispers of poison had once followed Eleanor wherever she went, a different narrative began to take its place, one that painted her not as a murderess, but as a mother who had endured years of quiet suffering under her late husband's cruelty, only to face a second betrayal from a man determined to steal what little peace remained to her. Alistair remained at Ashworth Hall through the following weeks, overseeing the formal legal proceedings required to clear Eleanor's name entirely and to secure her son's inheritance beyond any further challenge. The forged will was formally invalidated once handwriting experts confirmed what Alistair had suspected, that the signature had been added months after Lord Ashworth's death, traced carefully from earlier documents to mimic his hand. The physician, faced with the full weight of his fabricated testimony, cooperated fully with the investigation in exchange for leniency, providing detailed accounts of Edmund's scheme that left no remaining doubt as to its origins. Edmund himself, awaiting trial in the county's custody, offered no further defense, his earlier bitterness giving way to a resigned silence that suggested even he understood the futility of continuing to argue against evidence so thoroughly assembled against him. Alistair visited him once, more out of a desire to understand the full scope of his motivations than out of any lingering doubt regarding his guilt. "You had every opportunity to build a life of your own," Alistair said, standing outside the cell where Edmund sat with his head bowed. "Why destroy so much to claim what was never rightfully yours?" Edmund did not look up immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the confidence that had defined him during the hearing. "My brother was given everything from birth, the title, the estate, our father's affection. I spent my life watching him receive what I believed I deserved equally. When he died, I told myself I was simply reclaiming what should have been mine from the start. I did not allow myself to consider what it would cost the boy, or Eleanor, until it was already far too late to undo any of it." Alistair left the conversation with little satisfaction, understanding that Edmund's justification, however deeply felt, changed nothing about the harm he had caused. Some wounds, he realized, could not be reasoned away, only endured, and, eventually, healed through time, and the steady presence of those willing to remain. As the weeks passed, life at Ashworth Hall began to settle into a rhythm neither frantic nor fearful, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the household upon Alistair's arrival. Eleanor's son, no longer confined behind a locked door, spent his days exploring the grounds freely, his laughter becoming a familiar sound throughout the estate, one that Godfrey remarked he had not heard echo through these halls in years. Eleanor herself seemed to soften with each passing day, the guarded wariness that had defined her during their first encounter, giving way gradually to something warmer, more at ease. She and Alistair spent increasing time together, not out of necessity born from investigation or danger, but simply because neither found reason to seek distance from the other any longer. One evening, as autumn began to settle over the estate and the gardens turned gold beneath the fading light, Alistair found Eleanor seated on a bench overlooking the grounds where her son played nearby, chasing fallen leaves with an energy that spoke of a childhood finally allowed to unfold without fear. "I received word today that my business here is largely concluded," Alistair said, settling beside her. "The legal matters are resolved. Edmund's trial will proceed without need for further testimony from either of us. There is little reason remaining for me to stay." Eleanor's expression flickered with something she quickly tried to mask, though not quickly enough to escape his notice. "Then I suppose you will return to your own estate, to whatever life awaited you before a warrant brought you to my gates." "That is one possibility," Alistair said carefully, "though I confess it is not the one I find myself most drawn toward." She turned to look at him fully then, and in her eyes, he saw the same question he had been turning over in his own mind for days, uncertain how to voice it without overstepping the fragile trust they had built through circumstances neither of them would have chosen. "When I arrived here," Alistair continued, "I believed I understood exactly what awaited me, a guilty widow, a straightforward case, a return to my own life once justice had been served. Instead, I found a woman who had survived more than most people could imagine, who protected her son with a fierceness I have rarely witnessed, and who faced every danger placed before her without ever losing sight of what mattered most. I did not expect to find myself changed by this investigation, Eleanor, but I have been." "Alistair," she said softly, his given name unfamiliar on her lips after weeks of formal address, but not unwelcome. I spent so long believing that trust was a luxury I could no longer afford, that every kindness offered to me carried some hidden cost. You arrived prepared to condemn me, and instead, you became the one person who looked past every rumor to find the truth beneath it. I do not know how to express what that has meant to me. Perhaps you need not express it in words, Alistair said. Perhaps it is enough that we both understand it. The distance between them closed slowly, neither rushing toward a moment that had been building since the night he first noticed the bruise on her wrist and recognized, even then, that the story he had been sent to uncover was not the one being told by rumor and suspicion. When their hands finally met, resting together on the bench between them, it felt less like the beginning of something new and more like the natural conclusion of a journey they had walked together since the moment his carriage first passed through her broken gates. Her son's laughter carried across the garden, drawing both their attention as he waved toward them from beneath a large oak tree, entirely unaware of the significance of the moment unfolding between the two adults who had fought so hard to secure his safety. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that Alistair realized he had not yet seen from her until this very moment, and something in his chest settled into a certainty he had not expected to find when he first accepted this investigation. In the weeks that followed, Edmund's trial concluded with a verdict that surprised no one who had witnessed the hearing in the village hall. He was found guilty of fabricating evidence, orchestrating the abduction of a child, and conspiring to seize an inheritance through fraud, sentenced to a punishment that removed him permanently from any position of influence over the Ashworth estate or its heir. The physician, having cooperated fully with the investigation, received a lesser sentence, though his reputation and practice were ruined beyond any hope of recovery. Ashworth Hall, once a house holding its breath beneath the weight of suspicion and fear, slowly transformed into a home once more. Eleanor oversaw the estate's management with a steady hand, no longer burdened by rumor or threat, while her son grew increasingly confident and unafraid, his laughter becoming the defining sound of a household finally at peace. Alistair remained, not out of obligation, but out of a choice he made freely, recognizing that whatever life he had imagined for himself before arriving at Ashworth Hall had been reshaped entirely by the woman he had once come to judge, and had instead come to love. Their courtship unfolded slowly, respectfully, built on a foundation of trust forged through danger and truth rather than the fleeting attractions that often defined matches among their peers. When Alistair finally asked for her hand, standing in the same garden where they had first allowed themselves to acknowledge what had grown between them, Eleanor did not hesitate in her answer. She had spent years believing that safety and happiness were luxuries reserved for others, that her role was simply to endure whatever circumstances befell her and protect her son as best she could within those constraints. Alistair had shown her something different, that survival need not be a solitary endeavor, that trust, once broken, could still be rebuilt with the right person willing to prove themselves worthy of it. Their wedding took place the following spring, a modest gathering compared to the grand affairs typical of their standing, attended by those who had stood beside them throughout the ordeal, Godfrey among them, beaming with a pride that suggested he considered himself as much a part of their story as either of the two people exchanging vows. Eleanor's son stood proudly at his mother's side throughout the ceremony, no longer a frightened boy hidden behind a locked door, but a child secure in the knowledge that he was loved, protected, and free to grow into whatever future awaited him. As the ceremony concluded and the small gathering moved toward a celebration held within the very halls that had once echoed with fear and suspicion, Alistair found a quiet moment alone with Eleanor, away from the well-wishes and congratulations of their assembled guests. "I arrived at your gates prepared to condemn you," he said softly, echoing words spoken so long ago they now felt as though they belonged to an entirely different chapter of their lives. "I never imagined I would leave, having found the truest thing I have ever known. Nor did I imagine that the man sent to judge me would become the one person who finally saw me clearly," Eleanor replied, her hand resting warmly in his. "We found more than truth in each other, Alistair. We found a home neither of us knew we were searching for." Beyond the walls of Ashworth Hall, the county that had once whispered so readily of murder and scandal now spoke instead of a love story born from unlikely circumstances. A duke who arrived to condemn a widow and stayed instead to protect her, and a widow who had endured more than most could imagine, only to find, at the end of it all, that she was no longer alone. A year passed, and Ashworth Hall bore little resemblance to the guarded, fearful house Alistair had first entered. The gates that once hung broken on their hinges had been repaired, and stood open through most days, welcoming neighbors who had once whispered against Eleanor, and now called her friend without hesitation. The nursery, no longer bolted shut, sat empty most afternoons, its young occupant far too busy exploring the estate's orchards or riding alongside his stepfather to spend much time within its walls. It was during the celebration of the boy's 8th birthday that a final thread from the past resurfaced, one neither Alistair nor Eleanor had anticipated. A distant cousin of Lord Ashworth's, a man named Charles Pemberton who had remained largely absent from the family's affairs for years, arrived unannounced at the estate, claiming a right to contest the boy's inheritance on grounds that predated even Edmund's scheme. He carried with him old family documents, insisting that a clause buried within generations-old estate agreements gave him precedence should any question ever arise regarding the legitimacy of the current line of succession. Alistair received him in the study, the same room where he had once pored over ledgers, searching for evidence of Eleanor's guilt, now transformed into a place of quiet order rather than suspicion. Pemberton's claim, upon examination, proved thin, built on a misreading of documents that had been formally superseded decades earlier by clearer inheritance laws Alistair understood intimately through his own family's long history of estate management. You will find, upon closer study, that the clause you reference was invalidated when the estate was formally reorganized under the current legal code, Alistair said, laying the relevant documents before Pemberton, with the same calm precision he had once used to dismantle Edmund's forged will. Your claim, however sincerely believed, holds no standing before any magistrate in this county. Pemberton, lacking the calculated malice that had driven Edmund's scheme, accepted the explanation with far less resistance than Alistair had anticipated, admitting that he had acted more out of financial desperation than genuine belief in his claim's validity. Rather than pursuing further conflict, Alistair offered him a modest position managing a smaller property within the extended family's holdings, an opportunity to rebuild his circumstances honestly rather than through contested inheritance. Pemberton accepted gratefully, and the matter concluded without the danger or deception that had defined Edmund's attempt so completely. That evening, as the birthday celebrations continued in the gardens below, Eleanor found Alistair still in the study, reviewing the last of Pemberton's documents before setting them aside entirely. Another challenger, resolved before it could become a threat, she said, settling into the chair across from him, the same chair where she had once sat wrapped in a shawl, guarded and exhausted. Meeting his eyes for the first time, I confess I felt a flicker of the old fear when Godfrey announced his arrival. That fear served you well once, Alistair said. It kept you and your son alive through circumstances that would have broken many others. But you need not carry it so heavily any longer. Whatever challenges arise, we will face them together, as we have faced everything since I first arrived at these gates. Eleanor smiled, the guarded wariness that had once defined her expression, now replaced entirely by an ease that had taken root slowly over the past year, nurtured through countless quiet evenings, shared decisions, and the steady presence of a partnership neither of them had expected to find. Do you remember what you said to me, that first evening, when I asked if you had already decided my guilt? I told you that whether you were guilty remained to be seen, Alistair said, recalling the memory clearly despite the year that had passed. I meant it as a formality then, the practiced neutrality expected of an investigating magistrate. I did not yet understand how completely that answer would come to define the rest of my life. And now? Now I know the only guilt that ever belonged to this house was Edmund's, and it has been answered for in full. What remains is simply this. He gestured toward the window, where their son's laughter carried up from the gardens below, mingling with the sounds of the estate's small celebration. A family, built from truth rather than fear, and strong enough now to withstand whatever else the world sends against it. They joined the celebration together as the sun began to set over Ashworth Hall, the estate glowing gold in the fading light, its halls no longer holding their breath in dread, but filled instead with laughter, warmth, and the quiet certainty of a family that had fought for its peace and finally, fully, claimed it. The rumors that had once painted Eleanor as a murderess had long since faded into forgotten gossip, replaced by a story the county now told with genuine affection, of a duke who came to condemn a widow and found instead the truest purpose of his life, and of a widow who had endured betrayal, danger, and loss, only to build, from the wreckage of it all, a home filled with more love than she had ever believed herself allowed to hope for.